say I hope you don't mind me speaking from the rostrum. In my judgment, it's greater efficiencies of my energy to get the message I want to get across today. And that message is about not what we need to do. There's a lot of that in Rio 20. It's a great message. But it's whether you've got the political will to do it. And I speak as someone who was one of the few remaining negotiators at Kyoto in 1997 and have been almost 20 years in this process of negotiation in the level as the European negotiator in 1997 and indeed in opposition, but also as the Deputy Prime Minister. So I've been passionately involved in this. I believe in it. In all that period of time, there hasn't really been a disagreement about what we need to do. And in this document that we have before us, the future we want, it is laid out for us. I know a lot of committees might have put a lot of things into it, but it's all there. And it's the integration of all those parts that become essential if it's to be a successful Kyoto 2. Because Kyoto 1 was successful and, in fact, was one that we could support and need to make sure we get the Kyoto 2. So I'm not going to define or spell out what we want. The vision is there for us. It's been spelled out. How do you get the political will to achieve it? More and more discussions at more and more summits like this, we understand it all the more and we get the examples, as John was talking about. I was involved with him when he was doing some of that work in Quebec. There is ways to do it, but how do you get the system we've got at the moment to implement it? It needs political will. At Kyoto, we were only dealing with 40 countries, industrial countries. That wasn't easy, but it pales into insignificance of getting a consensus of 90-odd actual countries involved. And even with Kyoto, we had the Americans weren't prepared to sign up, the Canadians pulled out, the Australians said they weren't interested and wouldn't sign up to it. Though I do notice change. I noticed in Australia, when they addressed a conference I was at only last week, they are now introducing carbon trading. That's a complete reversal from the attitude they had at Kyoto. Very much welcome. Canada stayed on the side, but the regional agreements were actually important between Canada and America. Even if the president and prime ministers of those countries didn't agree with it, it still went on, and that was important to recognize. Of course, I welcome what President Obama says, that now he recognized the weather, perhaps that's influenced his mind now more, what has happened in America and some of these countries. But you know the statement he made, I read it in his first inauguration. It was good then, but nothing happened. And I suspect when he tells me he's going to use leadership, yes, we do want some American leadership. It hasn't been there for decades. I've got to say that if he wants to give a leadership, he gave it on Kyoto 1, against it, not for it. He's fought every kind of conference we've had of being involved in the principles of Kyoto, which is about that principle of common responsibilities. That is what is at the heart of this argument. So if you don't get the political will at that level, we have to continue without it. I was pleased to say on Kyoto 1, I did move, don't let's evolve with America. Don't give them the chance to veto it. Let's get on with it. This is a global problem. And we can't allow one country, whoever it is, to say, I'm not going to cooperate, so it falls. No, that's not to deny that we need America in that leadership role. So I'm reminded this week of something else that's going on about global conferences. It's the tale of two Davoses. Only last week, Davos, with all the rich people, the bankers, the politicians, the academics, all meeting in the wonderful circumstances of Switzerland. What did they discuss? They discussed the debt, they discussed the finances, the energy crisis, everything that affected them. They, in fact, were the architects of the ruddy crisis we've got today. Talk to me about bankers. They're not talking about what we're talking here about the future. They're not talking about using their power and influence to change the world, so necessary to avoid the catastrophe that the scientists and everyone tell us about. They want to, and I think the theme for theirs, it was called Resilient Brilliance. Does anybody understand what the hell that means? Resilient Brilliance, it was called. What it meant is business as usual. That's all they're concerned about, going back to business as usual. Now, that's not acceptable, and it's not where they solve it. And they said at the end, we're looking for a big idea. Now, I do confess they were on about the women in top boards not getting enough money. But honestly, I don't think that's the big idea. The big idea has been around for a long time. It's about the threat from global change, from climate change. The science evidence for it, the intellectual arguments for it, but that interest of self-interest still dominates the thinking in what is largely a Western combination of interests, which was referred to conferences of different interests. Well, that's the nature of the change. That's what's spelt out. But the big idea then is really nothing but they talked about. They said nothing about poverty. They said nothing about climate change. They said nothing about changes on climate that's necessary. They totally ignored all that. And therefore, what we have spelt out in this Rio 20 report, based on the principle which causes problems when they start to debate it, common but differential responsibilities. If there is to be equity, which is at the heart of any consensus and agreement, it means that the developing countries are going to have to develop at a faster rate than the richer countries. And that has major implications for emissions. But we have to recognize that's an essential part of reducing poverty. And poverty is an essential objective if you want consensus, and particularly in the developing countries. So to that extent, we're not going to great deal of support from them. And they have to recognize differential and equity is an important part of it. So the answer is there in the future we want. It's in this report. I think it's an excellent report. But one of the problems is it doesn't say too much about good governance. It's something we talk about at every conference, but what the heck do we do about it? In reality, the governance we have for delivering these problems is limited by the limitation of the UN, and anybody who's been involved in that, it's not a very good organization. Forget 93 countries, and anybody been at those conferences know it's difficult for the UN to clear. The governments themselves are controlled by interest groups. I receive and know from my own role as the Deputy Prime Minister, knocking on the door all the time. They didn't ask me about climate change. They asked me about their interests, their profitability, business as usual. Leave the trickle-down theory to business and they'll produce fair. Load of nonsense. It never happened in any of our countries, even in America, quite frankly. And we have to have a challenge for that. So really what we need to do is to recognize we need some political will in the system. Something's got to change. We can't continue talking in all these conferences. I want to make two possible changes to this conference because I think this conference talks about the issues and the crucial issues they didn't talk at Davos in Switzerland. We do it here at Davos here in New Delhi. This is the place where it really matters. This is where we're talking about equity. This is where we're talking about social justice. And this conference can come, led here in India and by the Indian government, to look at the ideas as the Prime Minister pointed us out today. Let that be the focus, the attention. After all, it is the majority of the developing countries that have the majority of poverty. We should be expecting that. And I want to say to Mr. Pachauri, a very close friend who's done excellent work on all these matters, two things he could do to this conference I would finish. Some of them have been mentioned here. One of the things Mr. Pachauri said, that what we need to do is to be able to extend this conference. And I would like to suggest, yes, you should. And the two things you should extend is one that is actually dealing with, great, the notes have fell on the floor, so I'll have to rely on my head. Two things. One of them, of course, is the regional dimension. What you've heard today is an important development, but it's got to be broadening it. So I say to Mr. Pachauri and I say to this conference, extend the membership of it. And one of them was mentioned, obviously, by John, the Globe Group, right? I don't know, does anybody know the Globe Group? It's 33 countries, just produced in a summit last week. Legislation by legislators in all these countries, how to do and to achieve what we've said. Spelt out in detail, the kind of Bible, if you like. Mustn't get too much into the Christianity and Islam issue, but if you look at this particular book, that tells you how to do it. Let globe, all the 33 nations, my 40-odd nations in the Council of Europe, which I'm in as one of the leaders, put them together and we'll have a body of legislators who are expected to demand on national governments to bring in the legislation necessary to meet the requirements of Kyoto 2. And the second point, therefore, if you do that, you bring those two together, that's a political arm to work more and more. Give us the political will. They can also develop the regional ones that John talked about. what we found there in Canada and North America, and indeed you can see it in some other countries, people get on with the job. So we need to develop at a lower level the regional and local policies. Last year, Mr. Pachari, I supported and worked with him on the 1 million homes to be lit in India, rural areas. So people could see by solar energy and the replacement of those solar lamps that it was a gain. And this isn't just pain, it was an improvement in ordinary people's lives. And then if you put that, and I went from that conference and just introduced this now, carrying no publicity in Britain, but I put to you as delegates anyway. It's a kind of conference, economies of low carbon cities. We have looked at my area of Humber, looked at the energy, looked at the demands, and we've been able to show by readjusting the energy, we can create 1,600 jobs. We can actually save 400 million on our expenditure, and we can cut carbon by 27%. We have to focus our minds with bigger political attention on looking at some of these alternatives, getting the people involved, the people's will, getting at the legislator, getting governments, and getting the people out in the national and local plans to make sure people understand what it's about. That's the way forward. Build up the political will. Less of the talking, more of the action. Of course, we still need the talking. Thank God, where do I go if they weren't talking? But basically, you need to have those actions, and that's what we've got to move to. And I hope, Pat, you'll consider that as being one of the important developments and changes we can make on this very important, real Davos here in Delhi.